There is a small container on most dinner tables in the world. In some kitchens, it is a shaker. In others, it is a small open bowl with a tiny spoon. In others, it is simply a bag or a box kept within reach. The contents are unremarkable. White crystals, essentially uniform, that you add to food to make it taste better. Salt. Sodium chloride. Two elements bonded together. One, a reactive metal that explodes in water. The other, a poisonous gas, forming a compound so stable and so essential to life that it has been traded, hoarded, taxed, and fought over for the entire recorded history of human civilization. Salt is not merely a seasoning, it is a preservative, an electrolyte, a currency, a weapon of taxation, a cause of revolution, and a material whose scarcity or abundance has determined the fate of cities, armies, and empires. The word salary is derived, it is often said, from the Latin salarium, a salt payment. Roman soldiers were allegedly paid in salt or given an allowance to buy salt. This etymology is not entirely certain. Historians debate whether soldiers were actually paid in salt or merely given money specifically for purchasing it. But the word's connection to salt is real, and it reflects something true about how salt was valued. In the medieval world, access to salt was the difference between a community that could preserve food through winter and one that could not. It was the reason certain cities became wealthy and others did not. It was the substance over which wars were fought and treaties made. And now it costs almost nothing, is present in almost everything, and we are increasingly told that we eat too much of it. The history of salt is the history of a material whose value has traveled from precious to mundane to actively concerning, a journey that no other substance in human history has made quite so completely. Sodium chloride is a crystalline ionic compound. Sodium ions and chloride ions arranged in a regular cubic lattice, held together by the electrostatic attraction between their opposite charges. It is found in seawater at an average concentration of about 3.5%. It is found in underground deposits, halite, left by ancient seas that evaporated millions of years ago. It is found in salt springs and salt lakes. On a geological timescale, it is not rare. But for most of human history, in most places, it was difficult to obtain in quantity. The human body requires sodium. Sodium ions are essential for the function of nerve cells. The action potential, the electrical signal that allows neurons to fire, depends on the movement of sodium ions across cell membranes. Sodium is essential for muscle contraction, including the heart. It regulates fluid balance, the distribution of water between the inside and outside of cells, between blood and tissue. The minimum daily requirement is surprisingly small, perhaps half a gram per day for a sedentary person in a cool climate. But before refrigeration, before modern food processing, before reliable ways to preserve food through winter, salt served another purpose: preservation. Salt preserves food by reducing the water activity available for microbial growth. When you add salt to meat or fish or vegetables, it draws moisture out by osmosis. Bacteria, fungi, and molds require water to grow. In a sufficiently salty environment, they cannot. The food is safe to eat for months or years. This is why salt was so important, not because people needed to season their food, but because without it, the food would not be there to season. Before refrigeration, before mechanical cooling became widely available, which happened primarily in the 20th century, salt was the primary technology of food preservation across most of the world. The ability to preserve meat, fish, vegetables, and dairy was not a luxury. It was the foundation of food security through winter, through drought, through any period when fresh food was unavailable. A community with access to salt could survive winter. A community without it was in serious danger. The exploitation of salt is ancient. Salt has been extracted from springs, lakes, and seawater since at least 6,000 BC, possibly much longer. Archaeological evidence of salt production has been found at sites in Romania, China, and the Sahara from the Neolithic period. In China, the salt trade was established and regulated by the government from at least the 7th century BC. The Chinese salt monopoly, the system by which the state controlled salt production and distribution, taxing it to fund government operations, is one of the longest-running economic institutions in human history. It lasted, in various forms, until 1993. The Silk Road, the network of trade routes connecting China to Central Asia, the Middle East, and eventually Europe, carried salt as well as silk and spices. The city of Timbuktu in what is now Mali was, at its medieval height, a major center of the trans-Saharan salt trade. Camel caravans carried salt slabs from the mines of Tagaza across the desert to the cities of sub-Saharan Africa, where salt was traded weight for weight against gold. Salt for gold. That is how rare it was in some parts of the world. In Europe, the salt trade created the conditions for the rise of certain cities that became wealthy as distribution points. Venice, before it became a center of glass manufacture, was a salt trading city. It controlled salt production in the lagoon and along the Adriatic coast, and it used this monopoly to fund its early commercial expansion. The Hanseatic League, the medieval trading confederation of northern European cities, was substantially built on the salt and fish trade. Baltic herring, preserved in salt from the mines of Lüneburg, fed much of northern Europe through the winter. The fish needed the salt to be preserved. The salt needed the fish trade to justify its extraction. The trade network needed the herring to generate the revenue that funded everything else. The road network of ancient Rome included routes specifically designed to transport salt. The Via Salaria, the Salt Road, ran from the Adriatic coast to Rome. The English town of Nantwich in Cheshire owes its suffix to the salt springs that made it an important production center in the medieval period. The German city of Salzburg, Salzburg means salt castle, owes its name and its original wealth to the salt deposits in the surrounding mountains. Place names across the world carry the memory of the salt trade in their syllables. The intersection of salt and political power is one of the most consistent themes in the history of this material. Because salt is essential and unevenly distributed, whoever controls the supply controls those who need it. This logic was understood by rulers across the world and across history, and it produced one of the most consistently applied mechanisms of taxation in the history of civilization. The gabelle, the French salt tax, was one of the most hated instruments of the French monarchy. Introduced in the 14th century and surviving until the Revolution, the gabelle required every person above the age of 8 in most of France to purchase a minimum quantity of salt at a fixed price from government warehouses. The price was set by the government and bore no relation to market value. In some regions, it was set at many times the market price elsewhere. The gabelle was applied unevenly. Different regions of France paid different rates, and the salt-producing regions of Brittany were largely exempt. This created both a flourishing smuggling trade and enormous resentment. Gabelle smuggling, faux sonnage, was a serious criminal offense punishable by branding, the galleys, or death. Thousands of people were prosecuted for it annually. When the cahiers de doléances, the lists of grievances compiled across France before the 1789 revolution, were examined, the salt tax appeared as a specific grievance in a remarkable number of them. The gabelle did not cause the French Revolution, but it was one of the injustices that the revolution was about. The British salt tax in India was structurally similar. The colonial government taxed salt produced in India, a country with a long coastline and abundant salt deposits, and prohibited the population from producing their own. This was not primarily a revenue measure, it was a control mechanism. The salt tax made Indian subjects dependent on the colonial government for a basic necessity that they were surrounded by. The effect on the poorest Indians was severe. Salt was essential for preserving food in a hot climate. The tax added substantially to its cost. The salt trade's greatest impact on European history was probably through its connection to fish. In medieval Europe, the Catholic Church required abstention from meat on Fridays and during Lent, periods that, in aggregate, amounted to more than 100 days of meatless eating per year. Fish was the primary substitute protein. Fresh fish was available only to those near water. The rest of the population, the majority, depended on preserved fish. Salt cod, salt herring, dried and salted fish of various kinds. The scale of the trade was enormous. The North Atlantic cod fisheries, the Grand Banks off Newfoundland, discovered by European fishermen in the late 15th century, were transformed by salt. The Basques, who had been fishing the North Atlantic for decades before Columbus's voyage and who had access to excellent salt from the Bay of Biscay, were producing salt cod at scale. The Portuguese, the British, and the French followed. The Grand Banks fisheries became one of the most commercially significant maritime operations in history, and they ran on salt. Salt cod, bacalhau in Portuguese, bacalhau in Italian, bacalhau in Spanish, was the protein that fed much of Atlantic Europe and its colonies for centuries. It was cheap, nutritious, durable, and could be shipped anywhere. It sustained sailors on long voyages. It fed the poor in cities far from any coast. The connection between salt, fish, and European expansion is not coincidental. The ability to preserve fish with salt made the long Atlantic voyages economically viable. Ships that could carry salt cod could sustain crews for months. The same preservative chemistry that allowed a medieval German peasant to eat herring in January allowed Columbus's sailors to cross the Atlantic without starving. Salt did not discover America, but it made the voyage possible. Salt has been a military factor in almost every major conflict in the pre-industrial world. Armies need preserved food. Before industrial food processing, before canning, refrigeration, and the other technologies of the 19th and 20th centuries, an army's ability to campaign depended on its ability to carry preserved meat and fish, and preserved food required salt. Napoleon's campaigns were constrained in part by salt supply. The retreat from Moscow in 1812 was catastrophic, partly because the French army's wounds could not be properly treated. Salt was essential for wound cleaning and preservation, and the supply had been disrupted. Gangrene and infection killed as many soldiers as combat. During the American Civil War, the Union blockade of Confederate ports specifically targeted salt production facilities. The Confederacy's salt works in Virginia and Louisiana were military targets. The Union understood that cutting the Confederate salt supply would undermine their ability to preserve food, which would undermine their ability to feed their army and their civilian population. Sherman's March to the Sea specifically targeted salt works as well as other industrial facilities. The deliberate destruction of salt supply was a recognized weapon of war. The city of Syracuse in ancient Sicily was a major salt producer. Its salt helped sustain the Athenian fleet, and its capture was one of the strategic goals of the disastrous Athenian Sicilian expedition of 415 BC, which ended in the destruction of the Athenian force and changed the course of the Peloponnesian War. Salt is not glamorous. It does not appear in the accounts of heroism and strategy that historians prefer, but it runs through every military campaign like an invisible thread. The chemistry of salt, seemingly simple, 2 elements, 1 compound, has been scientifically important in ways that go well beyond food preservation. The discovery that table salt dissolves in water to produce not salt molecules, but sodium and chloride ions, freely moving charged particles, was foundational to the science of electrolyte chemistry and to our understanding of ionic bonding. Svante Arrhenius's 1884 theory of electrolytic dissociation, for which he eventually received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1903, was built substantially on observations of salt solutions. Salt solutions conduct electricity. Pure water does not. The ions in the salt solution carry the current. This observation, made many times in various contexts from Faraday onward, was crucial to understanding what electricity was at the molecular level. The crystalline structure of sodium chloride, the regular cubic lattice of alternating sodium and chloride ions, was one of the first crystal structures determined by X-ray crystallography. William Bragg and his son Lawrence Bragg worked out the sodium chloride structure in 1913, using the technique they had just developed. Their work on salt earned them the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1915. The Braggs are also the subject of a story about paternal credit and the under-acknowledgement of younger contribution that this series has visited before. And then there is the specific contribution of Catherine Burr Blodgett, an American physicist who worked with Irving Langmuir at General Electric in the 1930s and developed techniques for creating monomolecular films on glass surfaces, work that has applications in optical coatings, anti-reflection glass, and surface chemistry. Blodgett was the first woman to receive a PhD in physics from Cambridge. She appears in almost no popular history of chemistry or physics. The science of salt, one of the simplest compounds, has been foundational to chemistry, crystallography, and electrolyte physics. And the people who built that science are, predictably, not all equally remembered. On the 12th of March 1930, Mohandas Gandhi walked out of his ashram at Sabarmati with 78 followers and began walking toward the sea. He was 60 years old. He walked 240 miles in 24 days. At the end of the march, on April 6th, he reached the coastal village of Dandi. He bent down, picked up a small lump of salt from the salt flats, and held it up. The Salt March, Dandi March, was one of the most effective acts of political theatre in the history of civil resistance. The immediate target was the Salt Act of 1882, which prohibited Indians from collecting or selling salt without buying it from the British government. The tax added substantially to the cost of a basic necessity for people at every economic level, but especially for the poor. Gandhi chose salt deliberately. It was a necessity for every Indian, regardless of caste, religion, or region. It was collected from the sea that ran along India's vast coastline, and prohibiting its collection, requiring Indians to buy from their colonial rulers a substance they were surrounded by, was an act of such naked colonial arrogance that it could be pointed to without ambiguity. When Gandhi picked up the salt, he was breaking the law. He was arrested. The British had not wanted to arrest him, They understood that making him a martyr would help the cause, but they had no alternative. More than 60,000 Indians were arrested following the Salt March. The movement spread. International attention focused on India. The legitimacy of the colonial government, its claim to be serving India's interests, became harder to maintain in front of a watching world. The Salt March did not win India's independence. Independence came 17 years later. But the march was a turning point, a demonstration that mass civil disobedience could challenge colonial authority, that the choice of symbol mattered, and that a 60-year-old man walking to the sea to pick up salt could change the political conversation of an empire. The story of salt has an ironic final chapter. For most of human history, salt was scarce, precious, and fought over. Now, it is cheap, abundant, and present in almost everything processed or packaged. The average person in a wealthy country consumes far more sodium than is physiologically necessary, not from the salt shaker on the table, which contributes perhaps a sixth of total intake, but from processed foods in which salt is added as a preservative and flavor enhancer. The health consequences of high sodium intake are contested in the scientific literature more than most popular accounts suggest. The consensus position, endorsed by health authorities in most countries, is that high sodium intake raises blood pressure in sodium-sensitive individuals, and that elevated blood pressure is a major risk factor for cardiovascular disease and stroke. Reducing sodium intake in populations is therefore a public health priority. The counter-evidence, and there is counter-evidence in the form of studies that find J-shaped relationships between sodium intake and health outcomes, with both high and very low sodium associated with worse outcomes, has been noted by some researchers. The debate is genuinely more complex than the simple "less salt is better" message often communicated. What is clear is this: the substance that was once so precious that it shaped the geography of trade routes, funded the construction of cities, provided the language for the concept of salary, and brought Mahatma Gandhi to a beach in Gujarat. That substance is now embedded in almost every packaged food, in quantities that may be damaging health at a population level. The mineral that empires were built on is now something we are trying to reduce. The history of salt is, in this last chapter, the history of abundance, turning a necessity into a problem. Salt is still there, on every table, in every kitchen, in the ocean that covers most of the Earth's surface, in the evaporite deposits under cities that were built above ancient seas, in the tears on your face and the blood in your veins. You contain approximately 250 grams of sodium chloride. It is in your blood, your tissue fluid, your cellular environment. Without it, your neurons would not fire, your muscles would not contract, your kidneys would not function. You are, in a real chemical sense, made partly of salt. The Roman soldiers who were paid in it, or paid to buy it, the medieval peasant who needed it to eat through winter, the Chinese emperor who controlled its distribution to control his empire, the Saharan trader who exchanged it weight for weight with gold, the Indian salt worker whose produce was taxed by a government 10,000 miles away, the modern factory worker adding it by the ton to packaged food. All of them, in their different centuries and circumstances, were dealing with the same white crystal, the same ionic lattice, the same two elements that explode and poison in their pure forms and sustain life in combination. The history of salt is not really about salt. It is about scarcity and abundance, about what happens when something essential is unevenly distributed. about the difference between what a thing is chemically and what it means culturally, about the way that the simplest substances can become, in the right circumstances, the pivot of an entire civilization. On your table, in your tears, under your skin, still there,